Good evening, everybody. Whether you're joining us in person or over the live stream, welcome to the Church of the Resurrection in New York. Tonight we have a very special event with both a lecture and recital by Aaron Tan. Without any further ado, please welcome Aaron Tan.
Good evening. In the early 20th century, society and culture changed more drastically and more rapidly than they ever had before. Developments in classical music paralleled this rapid change, as many composers quickly abandoned the grand romantic style. It was not only the fast pace of change that compelled composers of the early 20th century to break away from the romantic tradition. In the 19th century, classical music culture prized the sacred canon above all else and revered certain past composers as giants or heroes. This value, so integral to Romanticism, ironically led to its undoing later on. Acutely aware that they stood on the shoulders of giants, living composers in the early 20th century grew more and more self-conscious and anxious of whether their contributions would stand the test of time. Interest in early music, combined with progressivism in both industry and the arts, compelled many composers to rapidly innovate and change their styles by reshaping sounds of the distant past. Music historians have identified three early 20th century schools: the Impressionists, who delighted in color, timbre, and tonal ambiguity; the Neoclassicists, who reshaped the transparent textures and motivic conciseness of early music into a modern guise; and the Expressionists, who found ways to convey powerful emotions without the need for any tonal system. Whilst these composers forged radically new and different musical paths as a response to their heightened awareness and even anxiety of music by past masters, not all composers felt the need to abandon the musical language of Romanticism. This recital mainly explores works by early 20th century organ composers who firmly held on to the romantic aesthetic of sound, even while musical tastes were changing around them, or even if they did explore new trends in composition, did so too late for history to have memorialized them as pioneers. Also included on this program are two works representative of early modernism in organ music. It is worthwhile to perform this post-romantic organ music from the early 20th century, though the compositions may not have been viewed by their contemporaries as particularly progressive or innovative when they were first performed. In hindsight, I think we can find a freshness, approachability, and beauty in these lesser-known works that perhaps have a more tangible relationship with our 21st century ears than those of pure modernism or pure romanticism. While this lecture primarily focuses on the historical and stylistic context of tonight's music, you are also encouraged to peruse the program notes for musical details on individual pieces. A prime example of neo-romanticism in this era is the music of Siegfried Karg-Ehlert, whose Fantasy and Fugue of 1905 is the earliest written 20th century piece featured on tonight's program. The piece's first version was scored for the Kunstharmonium or Art Harmonium, a large reed organ which had more stops and registers than its French counterpart, invented and patented by François Debain in 1840. Karg-Ehlert was fascinated with the art harmonium's seemingly infinite timbral and dynamic possibilities, and its ability to go from the fullest sound to a whisper without a single registration change. The art harmonium gave Karg Ehlert the opportunity to continue to discover and develop his enormous interest and desire for color. After being introduced to the organ by his colleague Paul Hohmeier, organist of the Leipzig Gewandhaus, Karg Ehlert quickly realized that the organ possessed even greater tonal and coloristic possibilities than the Kunstharmonium. Karg Ehlert's compositional roots in the harmonium gave him the background to gravitate towards a symphonic treatment of the organ. Karg Ehlert would seek to draw as many colors out of the organ as he could, and could be highly specific in his registration instructions, which often included unique piston combinations and gap registrations. Some of Karg Ehlert's earliest organ pieces, such as his Fantasy and Fugue in D, Opus 39b, were transcriptions of his own harmonium compositions. Compared with the harmonium original, Opus 39a, the organ version adds substantial new pedal material, including another voice to the originally three-voice fugue. Organist Johannes Matthias Michel has classified Karg Ehlert's compositions into three main periods: his late Romantic period, lasting up to the First World War, to which the Fantasy and Fugue belongs; his Impressionist period from 1921 to 25, and finally his Expressionist period from 1930 until his death in 1933. Though his style after the war was indeed heavily influenced by Debussy, Schoenberg, and Scriabin, and though Karg Ehlert's compositions from this period were labeled by Michel as either being Impressionist or Expressionist, Karg Ehlert eventually came to regard the styles of these composers who he was formerly influenced by as fruitless artistic self-indulgence, he quotes, commenting to a friend that he sought to embrace, quote, the purity of classical and romantic art, end quote. Karg Ehlert began again in C major and prayed to the muse of melody. This fondness for melody is perhaps partly due to his encounter with the master melodist Edvard Grieg in 1903. Karg Ehlert's love of melody, coupled with his impressionist and international influences, makes him unique. His impressionism is not as amorphous as that of Debussy or Satie. The lush harmonic colors are often fitted within a regular and almost predictable phrase structure, often with strong cadential patterns at the end of each phrase. The setting of the plain song hymn Ave Maria from the suite Cathedral Windows, which you will hear tonight, is representative of his second Impressionist compositional period. And regarding his third Expressionist period, he would never really fully embrace the harsh dissonances of serialism, and even when he did write in a quasi-12-tone style, as in the fifth movement of his Idellen, Opus 104 for the harmonium, here the complex melody, 12-tone melody, is padded underneath by sweet-sounding triadic and extended harmonies, softening and making the atonality more palatable. Neither would Karg Ehlert adopt the transparent, more straightforward registration schemes of neo-Baroque-leaning German contemporaries like Hugo Dissler or Helmut Walcha, preferring to explore the multitudinous colors available to a romantic symphonic organ, which was, after all, why he was so attracted to the organ in the first place. Karg Ehlert's music was never well accepted in his homeland of Germany due to German nationalistic tendencies during his day, but he did have great success even into the 1930s, where sources report him as being the fifth most popular composer of organ music in the United States. In England, too, where conservative musical styles were maintained well after the turn of the century, his music was popular and widely published. Perhaps this popularity of Carg Eilert in England is not surprising when we consider what organ music in England was like during this period. A representative sampling of early 20th century English organ composers like Frank Bridge, Edward Bairstow, Basil Harwood, and Percy Whitlock, which we'll hear tonight as well, belie a trend that these organ composers were mostly musicians whose main musical output was either written for the church or the town hall. That the historically significant English composers, Vaughan Williams, Holst, Britten, composed only a handful of organ works is suggestive of the place of the organ in the wider English music scene. With the exception of Herbert Howells, one could conceivably classify the entire period of early 20th century English organ compositions to be at least a couple decades behind the times, heavily influenced by an Austro-German style, a slight air of pride in an enduring monarchy, and strongly catering to the church's liturgical needs. In keeping with compositional preferences of the island, English organ builders of this period were also conservative in their style of building and had no interest in adopting the rapidly changing tonal palettes brought around by the Orgelbewegung movement on the continent. These English builders preferred warm diapasons and rich-sounding reeds of the English Romantic organ school. Yet, even within this conservative English organ culture, new developments did occur. Through the pioneering work of Ralph Vaughan Williams, there was a revival in plainsong modality and most significantly folk song. One hears Vaughan Williams' influence on Percy Whitlock's compositions in Whitlock's employment of modal, folk-like melodies in many of his organ compositions, the majority of which are shorter character pieces. Until recently, Whitlock had a mixed reputation as a composer. Some thought of him as pandering to popular taste and writing frivolous, theatrical pieces of slight substance. Indeed, a portion of his output must have been written to satisfy his principal position as the borough organist of Bournemouth. A look at Percy Whitlock's larger-scale organ works, though, will reveal a master of thematic development, harmony, and even counterpoint. Written in 1929, his two quasi-Frankian fantasy chorales span a performance duration of almost half an hour. The influence of folk song and chromaticism is very apparent in the second fantasy you will hear tonight. In a continuous variation form, this second fantasy chorale is based on a 16-measure folk song-like tune in the Aeolian mode. In several passages that serve as bridges between variations, one finds a characteristic ascending chromatic bass line reminiscent of Franck, which destabilizes the harmonic framework and takes the listener to a different tonal center. The score's detailed manual changes, coupler instructions, and registration indications give evidence of Whitlock's intimate familiarity with organ colors and capabilities of the English Romantic organ. If composers like Vaughan Williams and Whitlock were embodying the folk tradition in England, composers like Leo Sowerby would create works distinctive of early 20th century American organ music. Like Whitlock, Sowerby did not directly quote folk tunes of his country. A 1938 review of Sowerby's music by Burnett Tuthill describes Sowerby's melodies as being wrought not from a specific type of American folk music, but rather, quote, from the absorption of their essential spirit and its reissue from the composer's creative imagination, end quote. Organist Elsie Perdicaris describes Sowerby's snappy, rhythmic, close-knit, lilting American sound merged with jazzy harmonies and blue orchestral sonorities. Sowerby was one of the few modern composers for the organ whose output reached deeply into other areas of classical music rather than just choral and organ music. Though in hindsight, he was nowhere nearly as pioneering as Aaron Copland or Charles Ives in exploring modernist compositional styles, he was able to achieve significant popularity for several decades in his life. In particular, Sowerby's symphonies were performed annually from the 1930s to the 1950s by the Chicago and Boston Symphony Orchestras. And celebrated organist E. Power Biggs championed and recorded Sowerby's organ concertos, even though they were never released. In terms of his organ compositions, Sowerby was most familiar with the symphonic organ style, being inspired by the 1920 Austin instrument at St. James Cathedral, Chicago, where he presided as choirmaster and organist for decades, and also the E.M. Skinner instrument at Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago, where he served as an assistant during his formative years. Unlike Copland, whose most enduring works, mostly from the 1930s, were written in a consciously vernacular idiom, Sowerby never did adjust his compositional style to please the masses. There are several critical sources acknowledging the well-crafted nature of Sowerby's writing, but that many works are, quote, coolly received because of the failure of musicians and public to grasp his idiom without more study and familiarity than they will give the trouble to give them, end quote. Dissonance occupied an increasingly pervasive presence as Sowerby's style matured. By the end of Sowerby's life, much of his music was no longer being regularly programmed, though he was certainly still a much respected and active church musician. It seems Sowerby occupied a compositional language that was both not modern enough to shock and not romantic enough to please. Only in the past couple of decades has Sowerby's organ music been slowly revived through the efforts of organists like Catherine Crozier and Francis Crociata. It is to France now that we turn in our final consideration of this era of organ music, and to one particular lineage of organist composers who claimed to continue the Bach tradition handed down from Lemons to Widor to Dupré and then to Demessieux. Tonight, we are not exploring the core of Widor's compositions, as those were written prior to 1900. Widor's final mature style, solemn, mystical, and sacred, had been born through his monumental 9th and 10th symphonies, Gothique and Roman, in 1895 and 1896, respectively. The remaining quarter century of Widor's life would be spent being an ambassador of French music and culture through his leadership of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and in 1921 becoming founding director of a new Franco-American conservatory program at the Fontainebleau School, Paris. The Conservatoire Américain offered 3-month summer programs for American musicians wishing to study in France, and its activities continue to this day. It was the founding of this institute, as well as the inauguration of a new organ at Fontainebleau, that gave Widor an excuse to compose for his instrument, something that he had not done for 25 years. As John Neer writes, quote, Bach's Memento, 6 pieces for organ, had the unassuming byline Transcription et Registration de Charles-Marie Widor. Far from being transcriptions, however, Widor's 6 favorite Bach movements are so freely arranged that they are arguably more Widor than Bach. William Hayes suggested that paraphrased, freely based themes on Bach's themes would be a more accurate description of the work. Indeed, the Matthäus Finale is as symphonic in manner as any movement from Widor's Opus 13 symphonies, end quote. It is interesting, though, to compare how similarly Widor treats Bach's original material to Gigoux's transcription, which will begin the program tonight, but was written 40 years before Widor's Bach Memento. Both transcriptions add their own lines of counterpoint to support the melody and also significantly modify the ending, either by abbreviating the piece as Gigou does, or adding an extra coda to Bach's original ending, as Widor did. By the time the war had ended, Widor began to realize his influence as a composer was waning. Like his good friend Camille Saint-Saëns, they were seeing their pieces programmed less and less at Parisian concerts in favor of music by Ravel and Debussy. A short article of Widor's in 1923 reveals his views on contemporary music, quote, "Is music in a state of progress or in a state of decadence? Those who view purely sensory effect as the ultimate aim of music will contend that we are progressing. Those, on the contrary, who seek in the art of music ideas and their highest development will feel that music is retrogressing," end quote. Widor's firm rooting in the past and tradition is evident in his emphasis on Bach in his performances, scholarly publications, and teaching, as well as his inspiration from plainsong melodies of the church during his final compositional phase. I thought it would be fitting tonight to include two transcriptions of Bach's works, both to represent a style of organ composition that existed prominently in this era that gradually fell out of favor, and also obviously to honor the birthday of the master by giving Bach both the first and last word tonight. The reins of power at the Paris Conservatory in the form of professorship of organ and improvisation passed to Marcel Dupré in 1926, as did the prestigious post of titular organist at Saint-Sulpice in 1934, previously held by Widor for over 60 years. Dupré followed in the steps of his teacher Widor, but went even further to emphasize the primacy of precision and virtuosity in all aspects of music making, characteristics which permeated both his teaching as well as Dupré's modernist compositions. Bruce Haynes, in his book, The End of Early Music, offers us a concise, albeit somewhat caricatured, definition of the main aspects of the modernist style. And Bruce quotes, "Modernism's concerns are accuracy and good intonation, literalism in reading scores, automatic, i.e. predictable tempos, and limited personal expression. Music reduced to audible mathematics, functioning like an automaton," end quote. Dupré could be considered the first modernist French organ composer, and because of his huge influence and fame, and the who's who of 20th century French organists who studied with Dupré, he could arguably have been said to usher in a new era of virtuosity and modernist compositional style in France. Save for a few early works, Dupré's modernist values are clearly heard throughout all of his compositions, including the tone poem Évocation of 1941, of which you will hear an excerpt tonight. The year 1940 was a cataclysmic one for France, but for Dupré, one can only imagine the weight of sorrow he had to bear with the death of his father in the same year. It is no wonder that the following year he would produce a deeply autobiographical work, the Évocation. This three-movement suite viscerally portrays the pain and turmoil of a war underway, a country under occupation, as well as the nostalgia of family and childhood. Composed and self-premiered in 1941, the symphonic poem's three movements are cyclic in nature, while drastically contrasting in depictive and emotional character. They share much thematic material. The final movement, Allegro deciso, is a fierce toccata in rondo form whose alternating quiet sections reuse themes from the previous two movements, remarked by Dupré to recall childhood memories of his mother playing the cello. Jean Demessieux was Dupré's star protégé. After having studied with Dupré privately and at the Paris Conservatoire for a combined almost 10 years, Demessieux gave her debut recital in 1946 at the Salle Pleyel and launched an international concert career. Her fiendishly difficult 6 etudes were premiered at her debut, as well as the 7 Méditations sur le Saint-Esprit, which were written the following year. We will hear the concluding movement of this latter set, entitled Lumière, or Light, specifying a registration consisting primarily of high mixtures only. Demessieux brilliantly creates wave after wave of sparkling figurations that vividly portray the text, inspiring the movement. Sadly, not much research has been made on this amazing composer and organ virtuosa. A search of all articles published in the American Organist Journal from 1979 to the present reveals only 2 articles written on Demessieux, and both of these focus mainly on her professional relationship and eventual falling out with her mentor, Marcel Dupré. I do hope that future scholars will be able to uncover more details of Demessieux's life and works in the coming years. Schoenberg, as one of the major proponents of musical modernism, valued progress over all things. In defense of abandoning tonality, Schoenberg said that, quote, "Our push forward had to be made. It was a push forward such as never was before. In fact, we have to break ground with each new work. Each work is something different, something new," end quote. For our neo-romantic friends, however, progress was clearly not the top priority. So what did they value? They continued the quest for vivid sonic colors. They crafted melodies that spoke to the heart. Even as they adopted emerging vernacular idioms, one can hear that they, like their 19th century counterparts, exhibited an exaggerated solemnity through their rapturous contemplation of the beautiful, to borrow Bruce Haynes' words again. Yet there is something that distinguishes neo-romantics from their immediate predecessors. Our neo-romantics were aware of the modernist developments taking place around them and did something that the romantics did not have to do. They chose not to adopt modern styles, instead opting to write in an idiom that audiences of their day would have been more familiar with. As performers, we face similar choices today. Could it be that we have been pursuing novelty and progress at the expense of connecting with our audience? Consider the American audiences of 3,000 to 5,000 that would clamor to hear Marcel Dupré perform in the 1930s. Whatever the various factors, be it declining church attendance, lower degrees of musical appreciation, or the unapproachability of much modernist organ music, the fact remains that by the end of the 20th century, the impact of organ music in the public sphere had been utterly decimated. Christopher Anderson notes that the most enduring image of the organ in the 20th century is its association with horror movies. If we want organ music to be relevant again, we must begin by constructing programs that are relatable, celebrate beauty, and of high compositional quality. I hope these qualities are apparent in the neo-romantic music I am presenting tonight. I would like to thank the Church of the Resurrection, Father Swain, and David Enlow for making this space so available for me to prepare and present this program for you, to Professor Martin Jean for his musical guidance over these past 3 years, to my peers and colleagues for their continued support, to Stefan Engels for providing very helpful research materials on Karg Ehlert, and to those viewing this program online, and to those of you here tonight, thank you for your presence and for sharing this evening with me.